Deep division as an agreement is just about hammered out at the COP29 summit. But developing nations say the annual $300 billion pledged by wealthier countries to help them cope with climate change is nowhere near enough. So how significant is this deal? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. So after 3 sleepless nights of back and forth among negotiators, a contentious deal on climate finance has been reached at the UN's COP29 summit. But deep divisions remain. So significant were the differences that at one stage the gathering of more than 40,000 delegates nearly broke up without any agreement. Developing nations say they've been forced by richer nations into accepting a bad deal, with the money pledged nowhere near enough to effectively fight climate change. The European Union welcomed the agreement as the start of a new era, but it coincides with another new era, the return of Donald Trump, who believes that climate change is a hoax. And what does all this mean for the fight against the global climate crisis? We'll speak to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Kulsum Sharif.
I hereby invite the CMA to adopt the draft decision contained in document
A deal agreed in overtime at the UN Climate Conference in Baku, Azerbaijan. Rich nations have pledged to give developing countries grants worth $300 billion a year by 2035 to help them cope with the effects of a changing climate and extreme weather. But it's not quite the agreement some developing nations had negotiated for.
We are disappointed with the outcome, which clearly brings out the unwillingness of the developed country parties to fulfill their responsibilities.
The deal follows 2 weeks of intense negotiations and high drama. Representatives from an alliance of small island states staged a walkout on Saturday, dismissing an initial offer of $250 million. The standoff pushed the COP29 summit to the brink of collapse. The final deal at $300 million a year is far short of the $1.3 trillion a year UN experts say is needed to fight climate change. That's the estimated cost developing nations will face in switching to cleaner energy sources and dealing with the impact of extreme weather. Some delegates say they were given little room to negotiate and were forced into accepting a bad deal.
This is what they always do. You know, they throw checks at us at the last minute, shove it down our throat, and then for the sake of multilateralism, we always have to accept it and take it. Otherwise, the climate mechanisms will go into a horrible down spiral, and no one needs that.
But there are others who are applauding the deal, saying it pledges more money than before.
COP29 will be remembered as the start of a new era for climate finance. We're tripling the $100 billion goal, and we feel it is ambitious, it is needed, it is realistic, and it is achievable.
China, the world's second biggest economy and second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, has agreed to contribute towards the deal. But the high-stakes talks in Baku have been overshadowed by Donald Trump's re-election as President of the United States. Trump has called climate change a hoax and withdrew the US from the 2015 landmark Paris Agreement on tackling it during his first term as president. But other countries say this agreement is a step in the right direction.
It's an 11th hour deal at the 11th hour for climate and for keeping 1.5 degrees alive. It's the right thing to do for Britain and the right thing for the world.
The Baku Accord is not legally binding, but it comes at a time when experts are saying the coming year is forecast to be the planet's hottest on record. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In London, we have Asad Rehman. He's the Executive Director of War on Want. He sat on the COP29 Coalition Steering Committee a global coalition that brought together civil society groups working towards COP29. Still in Baku is Harjeet Singh. He's the Global Engagement Director of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And also in London, Graham Gordon is the Head of Global Advocacy at Christian Aid. Welcome to the programme. First of all, Asad, I'll start with you. $200 billion short of what the developing world was asking for from the developed world. What are the real-world consequences of that going to be?
Well, the real-world consequences are that countries who are already being overwhelmed by climate impacts, by the devastation that we're seeing from killer floods, droughts, famines, will not be able to, one, cut their own emissions, adapt to these changes, pay for the cost of all of these extreme weather events, which are of course not their responsibility, and be able to safely and cleanly transition their economies away. Look, I think what is really important is to say that even that 1.3 trillion figure that was put forward by developing countries, that was a massive compromise. The UN estimates we'd need at least between 5 and 7 trillion a year. I mean, the cost of the damages that are being caused largely by the actions of rich developed countries, which have polluted historically the most and have got rich from it, is immense. And so what was put on the table, you know, in the words of developing country negotiators, was insufficient, inadequate, and an insult. And many people said it was a joke, but it's a deadly joke for both people and planet.
Harjeet, was it a frustrating to be there in Baku at the end of this when that figure was announced?
Well, absolutely. We reject the outcome. It's a betrayal. And as Asad said, this is woefully inadequate. The reality is that developing countries have put their ambitious plans on the table. They are showing so much of boldness and courage to move away from fossil fuels, despite also facing rising climate impacts. And they end up spending their own money to adapt and recover from these increasing disasters. But the reality is that developed countries have not paid their fair share of climate finance. So it's $1 trillion less than what developing countries demanded. And we need much more money, and the cost of climate action is in trillions. And also the deal is not clear in its details. You know, it really kicks the can down the road that they're going to continue to provide $300 billion annually by 2035. And they've always played games with the legal interpretation of language, and something that they were also trying to do to reinterpret the Paris Agreement itself. So we are deeply disappointed. Of course, we'll continue to fight back, but this is not how we should have left Baku. And there's a big question mark now on the entire multilateral process.
Graham, what do you think the real-world consequences of this are? And is there a question on the future of this multilateral process?
Well, I think developing countries came to these talks already adapting to climate change. So it's a real life issue. So in islands like Tuvalu, moving people from the coastal areas or even to other countries. In Kenya, adapting food systems to be more resilient to drought and floods. And in Brazil, giving titles to indigenous lands who can better protect some of the rainforests. And I think developing countries came asking for solidarity and partnership, and they went home wanting. So the real life consequences are they won't be able to adapt any further, and they won't be able to transition to renewable energy on the scale that we need. We know, for example, that in Belgium, there was more solar panels built and installed last year than throughout Africa. And actually, we just need this kind of investment. We need investment for transition. It's in all of our benefits. In the West, we can adapt to a certain extent. It's not going to cause the same amount of loss of life as it is in developing countries. But estimates are around 300,000 people who lose their lives each year due to climate change. That is only going to grow the longer we put off action.
Asad, one of the suggestions was that to meet this shortfall, developing world countries could approach international lenders, for example, and borrow the money they need. Is that how this is going to have to happen?
I mean, let's just understand that. This is the equivalent of an arsonist burning down your home, turning his back and then saying to the victim, now you can borrow some more debt-creating loans from me to fix the problem. there is a legal obligation for developed countries to provide this finance. And what developed countries are basically saying to developing countries is, we are going to refuse to pay that money. And that 300 billion, for example, is not grant-based money. Nobody knows actually how much of it will be grant-based, how much will be debt-creating loans. What we do know is in the last finance goal that was promised, 100 billion, less than 30 billion plus was actually in new and additional finance. Developed countries double counted existing finance flows. They double counted pretty much everything. And I expect them to count the kitchen sink in this. So looking to the private sector, particularly those who want to profit from disaster. Look, there is no profit to be made in helping many people survive the impacts of climate crisis. Yes, there are sectors where the private sector can come in, but what this really requires is state intervention, is grant-based finance. When these disasters happen in the global north doesn't look and say, let's go and borrow more money or look to the private sector. They look to the government, and the government intervenes. And, just looking at the United States, for example, in recent years, it spent over $1.7 trillion federal money in addressing these climate impacts. And what they're saying to developing countries is, you won't have that. You have to go and create more debt, borrow more money from the markets and debt-creating loans. We've got to remember, many of the poorest countries are already trapped because of unjust debt, tax and trade, and they're locked into poverty. This is simply overwhelming them. It's passing the buck to developing countries for a problem they didn't cause.
Harjeet, the Indian representative, was particularly vociferous. Chandi Raina called the process staged, managed, and said the agreement was nothing more than an optical illusion. It's hard to find anybody there from the developing world that was satisfied with this. Was there anyone satisfied that at least they got an extra 50 billion more than they were asking for?
Well, that's exactly was the game plan of developed countries when they dropped the number on the last day of COP29 negotiations. Just imagine, we have been working on this goal over the last 3 years. We had scores of meetings and high-level dialogues, yet developed countries never disclosed that what amount they are actually coming up with. So on the last day, you drop the number, you offer 250, and then after the uproar and the kind of response they got, they increase it by $50 billion. That's the kind of game they have been playing when they know that needs are running in trillions of dollars. And Indian delegate was rightly extremely concerned that this money is also full of loans, and they're depending on multilateral development banks like the World Bank and IMF, which have a history of not only promoting fossil fuel extraction, but also arm twisting developing countries to agree to policies that made them far more vulnerable, and they have extracted their resources. So the reality is that this goal itself is not real. And we know what happened with $100 billion target, where by their own admission, 69% was loan. So we need to recognize that it is intensifying the debt crisis. And another connection that we should see, which is linked with climate impacts and fossil fuel extraction. Many countries like Ecuador, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Mozambique are going to be stuck with fossil fuel extraction because they have very high debt levels. So what we are doing by offering loans and not grants, we are actually making things worse for developing countries in so many ways, be it the debt crisis and also exacerbating the climate crisis.
Graham, you were there in Baku for the first week. Was there an expectation from developing countries that the developed world that did most to create the greenhouse gases, the consequences of which we're now living with, might have shown a bit more solidarity with the challenges the developing world now faces from the consequences of climate change?
I think this COP was unusual in that right from the start, the expectations were low, and the COP presidency didn't help by talking about fossil fuels as being a gift from God and to be exploited. And I think it started off in bad faith. It started off without the years of negotiations that should have been happening on finance. And then it's not a surprise that we came out with what we did. So I think it doesn't mean that the multilateral system is broken, but it does mean that we need to think about how we do COPs differently. It's really important a presidency is prepared. I think the presence of fossil fuel companies, nearly 2,000 delegates, lobbying to derail a deal, lobbying to remove mention of fossil fuels from the final text, doesn't bode well. And I think we have to make sure that those who are at these negotiations are actually driven for a deal. And in the end, I think it was politics and profit that trumped over lives and livelihoods. And we need to regroup, and we need to work with Brazil going up to COP30 and to make sure that the issues that weren't addressed, where to get the money from in a realistic way, like global tax on aviation or on fossil fuel profits, or even redirecting the billions of fossil fuel subsidies that Western countries spend each year. We need to really dig down into those, because the money is available. There just wasn't the will to put it on the table. And I think developing countries rightly go away disappointed, but we need to regroup and we need to keep fighting for what it's needed, because it's not ultimately a question of can we afford it? It's a question of can we afford not to act as quickly as we need to.
Asad, just touching on what Graham was saying there, doesn't COP remain an important forum, though, particularly for developing countries who this is where they get to have their voices heard? There is still, the developing world turned up. It shows a commitment, does it not, to the Paris Climate Accord?
No, absolutely. Look, the climate talks are critical. It's the only place where every country has a voice, where we as civil society also act as the ears and the voices of all the people on the front lines of the climate crisis. It's not the COP itself that's a problem. It's the politics of rich developed countries coming there. Look, we had a dire warning from the UN just before we entered these talks, where the 1.5 degrees is on life support. We're going to bust through the 2-degree target and head towards 3 degrees by the end of the century. We saw that, and the reason that we're heading in this direction is because the United States was determined not to have science-based and equity-based binding targets. It wanted pledges. Those pledges are leading us to 3 degrees. Now it wants to do the same to finance. Instead of having binding targets and real clear commitments, it wants to make vague promises. The private sector will provide this money. And if we don't have this money, as Graham said, the cost of inaction is going to be devastating, not just in lives lost, but in the consequences for our global economy, for countries. Will make the last crisis look like it was, it's going to dwarf anything that humanity has ever faced before. And so what we need is developed countries, the US, but also the United Kingdom and the European Union, who hide in the shadows of the United States, don't speak out, don't distance themselves, don't point the finger at the United States and say, we've got to step up and take our legal responsibility. What's happening here is people are trying to basically burn down the Paris Agreement, and it's the rich developed countries because they think that that's the way to get out of their obligations.
Harjeet, the thing is, we're going to have a US president soon who is a climate change denier. There's no getting around that. How do you mitigate for that?
Well, Trump coming back is bad news for climate action, bad news for the global cooperation, and bad news for the planet. Not because the US has been doing a lot, but we cannot let the biggest historical emitter and top fossil fuel producer off the hook. And Trump is going to cause a massive reversal of clean energy policies in the US, undermining the hard-won gains of the last few years. And he's going to go much more for fossil fuel production. He already said it in his so-called victory speech that he's going to go for drill, baby, drill, and he's not going to provide any climate finance. I think this is where it's the responsibility of the states, philanthropies, civil society, and even businesses who believe in climate change. They must step up. And we need a movement in the US which actually makes people aware of the historical responsibility of the United States, which governments have not done. Over the last 30 years, we have seen more obstruction from the US irrespective of governments. So Trump cannot just be an excuse for, I would say, the larger US population and different parts of the society to not meet their global responsibility. They now have to step up much more than just depending on the federal government, because as a nation, they have a huge responsibility towards the global South to help them transition away from fossil fuels and also respond to the rising climate impacts.
Graham, if Trump pulls out of the Paris Climate Accords and then he cuts funding for Ukraine, Europe's going to have to pick up the slack on the money missing for Ukraine. Where's the money going to come from to fill the gap left by COP29?
I think in terms of finance, it's often portrayed as a battle between very precious aid money and piling in the private sector, which largely will only bring in money for mitigation and when there's profits. But there are various other options on the cards, and particularly Brazil is pushing them. So things like countries can redivert their fossil fuels, currently around 280 billion a year, I think, in the Western countries alone. We can look at taxing global wealth. We can look at taxing profits of fossil fuel companies. And all of these can produce around 500 billion a year. So there are ways of getting money if countries will work together and if we will move beyond the kind of technically feasible to the politically possible. And I think for me, I characterize it as there's a kind of computer says no approach to financing, saying we can't stretch the public pot, but actually global cooperation shows that we can do that. And additionally, debt relief, it's not new money, but actually debt relief in many African countries is diverting money from climate action. So debt cancellation, making private creditors come to the table of debt relief. There are various options on the table which don't hang or fall on US politics and what the US does. And then just finally, China is stepping up. China has recognized it's in its own economic self-interest to really push the clean energy transition. It needs to pull out of a lot more fossil fuel development that it is planning for the future, but actually you can get Chinese money as well as other money to be investing in some of the transition as well. So there are various options on the table, but countries need to not hide behind the US and need not to think it's all over because the US might be going in a different direction.
Asad, Graham just talked about China there, but it raises this question about what a developed country is, and that was a discussion, wasn't it? Because developed countries are perhaps an old-fashioned definition, and newly rich countries like China, like Saudi Arabia, fiercely resisted attempts to put them in the developed category. That's not helping either, is it?
Look, there are clear categorizations, right? I mean, the problem we're dealing with now is not just simply about who's emitting today or in the last 5 or 10 years. It's because of who's been emitting for over a century, 150, 200 years, who's got wealthy from that. And that actually categorization hasn't really fundamentally changed much. Per capita emissions are still greater in the global north than they are in the global south. Yes. Even with China and India, newly emerging developing economies, their historical responsibility is still greater in the global north than it is in the global south. So yes, there can be some conversation, but fundamentally, that's not the real problem. The real problem is that there is a legal obligation under the Climate Convention, under the Paris Agreement, for developed countries to provide. And developing countries, because they're, of course, still tackling issues of inequality and poverty. I mean, Harjeet will tell you, if people talk about India as a major economy, still has hundreds of millions of people trapped in poverty. There are many domestic challenges for developing countries that they're also dealing with. They can contribute, and in fact, they are contributing. China and other countries are putting more on climate finance than many developed countries who've got the legal obligation.
Harjeet, can I ask you about this deal on carbon credits? Because that now allows countries to bring in these credits to offset these emissions or trade them on a market exchange, and there's supposed to be a proper way of measuring them now. Is that at least helpful? Oh no, you're shaking your head. Why not?
Bernard, my expressions do tell you this story. The fact is, on the very first day, they passed some of the standards which are so weak that they are going to allow double counting. They're going to allow false solutions, or what we call them dangerous distractions. And not just that, they're going to start counting the carbon market trading also as part of climate finance. that's like a double, triple jeopardy that we are looking at. So, and you don't regulate markets. So the committee that was supposed to set the standards itself did not follow proper process of reaching out to all countries to first allow them to agree than just ramming it through on day one. So we have huge concerns about the way carbon markets are being created and the way they are celebrating passing the rules. We know that that's not going to help. And history tells us that carbon markets have not been successful. If that had been the case, how come our emissions continue to rise? And how come we have not generated enough resources to support countries in moving away from fossil fuels? So carbon markets are not a solution. In fact, they are a false solution, and we must reject them. What we need is stronger regulation. What we need is direct financial support to smaller businesses who are ready to make a transition but do not have access to technology and finance. So carbon markets are nothing but pollution permits that we are promoting, where large corporations, instead of making a shift towards clean energy, are going to buy these cheap pollution permits and will continue to pollute and exacerbate the climate crisis.
Time is against us, unfortunately, but Graham, can I quickly ask you, is this 1.5 Celsius goal still attainable in terms of limiting the level of global warming?
It is still attainable, but it's going to need a lot more work than we've seen so far. I mean, some signs of hope, some to grab onto. Both Australia and Canada said they wanted to see stronger language on fossil fuels. They are too big polluters, fossil fuel developers. So if countries like those can actually push for that and can rapidly reduce their own fossil fuel development, then we have hope.
And Asad, quickly from you, do you think it's attainable?
I think it requires a much more honest conversation in the global north about the fact that we need to be at real zero cutting emissions by 2030 if we want to have any chance of limiting temperatures below 1.5. At the moment, we're banking on risky, unproven and dangerous technologies sometime in the future. It's, I'd say 1.5 is on life support.
And very quickly, last answer from you, Harjeet. What do you think?
Well, if we really want to stay below 1.5, we have to support developing countries in making a transition, because that's where most of the people live and that's where most of the emissions are going to come, because they are still industrializing and they have to provide jobs. It will be suicidal if we do not support developing countries, because emissions anywhere are going to affect everybody. So it's in the enlightened self-interest for developed countries to actually act responsible and support developing countries so that we all can survive on this planet.
All right. Thank you very much to all of our guests, to Asad Rehman, to Harjeet Singh, and to Graham Gordon. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussions, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.